More than 64,000 people signed up to demonstrate in London against Trump's visit. More than 100 protests are expected during his 4-day visit to the country. Our UK correspondent Paul Barber has been monitoring the visit, and he joins us on the line and live actually from London now. Paul, literally thousands of people showed up protesting against this visit. Was it as expected, the size and the number of the protesters?
Certainly a very large protest was expected, many thousands across the country, marches happening in Manchester, in Glasgow, but really the centre of it all happening here in the capital, of course, in the United Kingdom. So what we've had is two massive waves of marches marching through the centre of London, and it's all culminating behind me here in Trafalgar Square. Of course, that famous piazza in the heart of London where South Africa houses the South Africa High Commission. So we don't have exact numbers at the moment, but certainly the whole of London, the whole of central London brought to a standstill, starting around midday today with protesters banging pots and holding placards. Certainly the message of those placards being that Donald Trump is not welcome here, Donald Trump go home, and Donald Trump not welcome, Donald Trump world's #1 racist was another common one. Also many placards that were simply unrepeatable, of course, but it's all culminating in this big rally in Trafalgar Square about to kick off in about 20 minutes or so, which will be coinciding, of course, with President Trump's meeting with Queen Elizabeth II to have tea at Windsor Castle. That's many miles away from here, west of London, but we can safely assume that President Trump is aware of these protests. He's expressed displeasure that they were allowed at all, and that the baby blimp balloon was, which was let up in the sky for a couple of hours a bit earlier, just down the road outside Parliament. I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's actually an American flag there. There was a pro-Trump rally happening just next to Trafalgar Square, but only about 10 people that I could count. They're surrounded by the anti-Trump protesters, but it's mostly been a peaceful mood, pretty good-natured, very loud indeed. President Trump had been criticising the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying that he was responsible for terrorism and crime being so bad here in the UK, but Sadiq Khan saying, well, something that the UK shares in common with the United States is a belief in free speech, and this is free speech in action, even if the taste levels of the protesters are something that foreign leaders here being protested against don't like. But certainly a very, very big protest here in London, and coinciding with this meeting about to happen between Trump and Queen Elizabeth.
So, you know, protests against Donald Trump, this is something that he's gotten used to seeing. And another thing that he's getting used to is that he has to come face to face with people that he often criticizes. And he had a few words about Brexit and Theresa May. How did their meeting go?
Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, the day started with this explosive interview that Donald Trump had given to the Sun newspaper, essentially saying that Theresa May's Brexit strategy would mean that a free trade deal with the United Kingdom between the US and the UK might not be possible, and saying that the way she was handling Brexit was not what he had suggested, and also saying that Boris Johnson, until recently the Foreign Secretary, of course, he resigned on Monday after the latest Brexit plan was brought together by Theresa May and the cabinet, and saying that, well, he would make a great Prime Minister, he'd make a terrific Prime Minister. So certainly a shockingly bad start to his first official trip to the UK as President. But since then, they have met, Theresa May and Donald Trump have met down at Chequers, west of London, the Prime Minister's country retreat, to talk about all these things, to talk about trade, to talk about security, terrorism, and of course Brexit. And at that press conference at Chequers, certainly a big change of tone. Donald Trump even denying that he'd said certain things in this interview, that he had criticised Theresa May and her Brexit strategy, saying that the UK-US relationship was stronger than ever, that the special relationship was better than it had ever been, and that the relationship between Mrs May and Mr Trump was excellent. So Mrs May saying that, well, I receive a lot of advice on Brexit, and but it's my job to go and negotiate on this. So the British government trying to some extent to sweep those comments under the carpet and forge ahead. And of course the US and the UK are incredibly close allies at an institutional level. It is really these personalities that these sort of issues have been coming up with Mr. Trump, but the trip is not over yet. Massive protests here after that trip, after that visit rather, with Queen Elizabeth. President Trump will be heading up to Scotland, where he'll be having a weekend at his own golf course. That is said to be a private weekend for the president before he heads off to Helsinki for that meeting with President Putin of Russia. But we can expect a few more protesters to turn up in Scotland as well. Back to you.
Or is he going to get a chance to address Parliament? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't ever want that to happen. But it is something that's not unusual for a visiting head of state.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly unusual for the President of the United States not to be going to Downing Street, not to be going to the Houses of Parliament to address both Houses of Parliament. This is a very quick, very marginal visit. Certainly very unusual to see a US President being greeted with this level of protest in the capital, and these were exactly the kind of scenes that the British government was determined to keep Donald Trump as far away as possible from, lest it should upset him. But of course he can watch TV, so he knows this is going on. But still, there is an element of support for Mr. Trump here, that he speaks his mind and that his views on Brexit are valid, for example. So it's not like this country is 100% united against this president. However, there is no denying that the feeling of unhappiness that he's even been invited is very strong, and the fact that Theresa May invited him just 18 months ago, just after he'd been elected president, invited Donald Trump to a state visit. This is not a state visit. He's not been given that privilege. He's not going down the mall outside Buckingham Palace in a carriage to meet Queen Elizabeth. She was said to be uncomfortable with the idea of that. So it's just a bit of a sort of a half-hour cup of tea with her instead. It's still a big privilege, and certainly one that we expect Donald Trump to enjoy. Whether he will leave this country in a better frame of mind about what is happening here with the government, with the leadership here, we'll have to see. But Queen Elizabeth certainly used to dealing with heads of state of all sorts. She's seen many in her decades in her role as head of state, and we can expect her to conduct that meeting with President Trump as she would any other meeting, certainly very calmly and with a lot of tact and discretion. So we'll have to see what he says after that.
All right, Paul, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much indeed for that update. That was our UK correspondent Paul Barber, who's been monitoring Donald Trump's visit to the UK, and he's been met with